Basically, in this talk, what I want to accomplish are two things. What I want to do is to use the work of some non-historians, non-professional historians, to ask, first of all, what history is for and how, in an age of interdisciplinarity, and in the centre that Inanna is so ably running, in the age of interdisciplinarity, how should history be done? Let me situate myself a bit first. As Inanna has said, I'm a historian of science, and I relish the perspective that particular discipline gives, an approach to history and to society that requires a deep engagement with both the natural and the social sciences, as well as a broad definition of what might constitute sources and what might constitute modes of communication, and a sometimes cavalier attitude to the traditional periodizations of history according to chronology and to geography, which I think are problematic. I've just finished this project, as Inanna mentioned, which investigated how the history of the future developed over the course of the 20th century in the UK, and making particular use of science fiction. As Inanna mentioned, I actually managed to get somebody to pay me to sit on my bottom and read science fiction. I still can't get over this. I've clearly used up all my funding left for the rest of my life from just that one project. But making particular use of science fiction as a means of understanding the evolving relationships between science and society, and what Asimov and others have called the socio-technical imagination, or socio-technical imaginaries. I'm still deeply interested in the history of the future, and whether that's at the global or at the local level. And I'm currently engaged in gathering a team of people together who can provide an interdisciplinary perspective on what it means to conceptualise the future. What is the future as a concept? What kind of work is it doing? How can we operationalise it, again, in an interdisciplinary fashion? But what I want to do today is to look, as I said, at how history is being used by non-historians. In this case, Cliodynamicists, if that's even a word, which I'm not sure it is, and by novelists, to tell stories about the global future and to consider what the investigation of things that haven't happened yet and might never happen, what can that tell us about evolving historical practice after the cultural turn and in the middle of a period of anxious digitisation? Essentially what I want to do is try and show you some different ways of conceptualising the future, both scholarly and literary, to the extent that those two modes can ever be disentangled. And I want to place that in the context of an abiding desire to make a difference, to envisage or to model the future in a way that enables it to be changed for the better. That is to say, putting our academic research to work in the effort to create a public good, quote unquote. And in the context of that, how the past is understood as relating to the future. I want to chart some ways of thinking differently about that relationship, particularly with respect to fiction and the emotional imagination. And I want to consider, finally, how scientific reflexivity might relate to the digital humanities in the prospect of what you could call a post-human age. So, let me begin. Sorry, should we move that forward? There we go. Get it to the right slide and we can move on. So let me begin by telling two stories. In January 2010, almost a decade ago, the journal Nature invited a panel of experts to speculate, in a very informed way of course, about what the sciences were going to be looking like in 2010. How were internet search engines going to change the way in which we thought about knowledge? What was the shape of global governments going to be looking like? How far would we have progressed towards low carbon economies? What would the university of the future be like? Those kind of things. And of course, these speculations provoked a number of letters to the editor. This is the kind of thing that tends to happen when you do stuff like that. One of them came from Peter Turchin, an ecologist at the University of Connecticut. And what he was doing was criticising what he perceived as the very comfortable, almost utopian futures that were being sketched out by the expert panel. He was emphasising that by 2020, increasing political instability was likely to undermine these tremendously progressive, very, very hopeful visions. His work on mathematising history, developing Cliodynamics, had led him to identify that a crisis was coming. A spectre, indeed, was even starting to haunt the academy, and that this crisis was likely to peak around 2020, the very date that Nature had invited speculation on. Now, given events since 2016, this prediction appears to have been pretty accurate, which is why you will have seen quite a lot of coverage of Cliodynamics in the newspapers in recent years. The second story takes place a little earlier. In 1998, the science fiction writer Octavia Butler published the second book in her Parable series, The Parable of the Talents. If you haven't read it, I do recommend it. This was following the fortunes of a young woman called Laura Oya Olima, a young woman living in the near future 21st century California, where the water's gone, the environment's parched, and all of the functions of a civil society have been turned over to the market. In a world with little or no water, the fire brigade only turn up if you paid them. And in an era where, or in a world where bodies lie unclaimed on the streets, you don't send your kids to school, you school them at home. The social contract has fragmented. Only upstanding Protestants and mostly white Christians can truly be citizens of this new California, this new United States. And crucially, this has been at the centre of the rise to power of the president that Butler has in her book. President Jarrett, who has come to power by harnessing religious fundamentalism, fear and resentment, and who, crucially, remember she was writing in 1998, promises to make America great again. She was a couple of years out with her slogan. But she did explicitly situate her novel in a tradition that she called the If This Goes On story, which refers to an earlier effort by Robert Heinlein, another science fiction author, to spell out, he was writing in 1940, to spell out what a theocratic United States would look like. Heinlein has the backwards, charismatic, fundamentalist preacher Nehemiah Scudder being elected to the presidency in the 2012 election. And as a result, as he ominously notes in about the second page of the book, in 2016 there was no election. Would that would have been the case. There we go. So, did Turchin or Butler or Heinlein predict Trump? Of course they didn't. There's a big difference between prescience and prediction. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that there are two very different approaches to anticipation. They take us to the same place, but they're very, very different. On the one hand, what you've got is an explicitly fictional, qualitative, imaginary effort to project and to create a future and to encourage you as the reader to emotionally ground yourself in what it would be like to live in a world that has changed to this extent. What is it like to live this way in the hope and the fear of what is to come? And on the other, you've got a mathematical, data-driven, quantitative model, that aims at detachment. That aims at detachment, at objectivity, and at the capacity to develop hypotheses which can then be tested against immense data sets. And then from that, used to ground projections of likely future scenarios. They're very different methodologies, but they're essentially doing the same kind of thing, using history and historical experiences to anticipate global futures in order that we might, if we should feel so inclined, avoid civilization's collapse. The question, obviously, of who we are in that statement is open. One key piece of advice that can be extrapolated from Turchin's work is that if you want to avoid political crisis, his main lesson is that you need to cut down on the number of university graduates. Basically, there's too many people are being produced and are anticipating jobs that are well paid. So basically, if you take away that anticipation, then you've solved the political crisis problem. Even though most of us in this room are involved in the process of producing said graduates, we're not really in any position to change UK higher education policy. Although if you are, I would quite like a word afterwards, if that's okay. And it's ironic in this context to contemplate H.G. Wells' famous complaint that not enough money is being spent on universities on future-proofing. Famously, he complains in a broadcast in 1931 that there are all these professors and students doing history. Well, what is the point of that? You've got too many people doing history, and there's not one professor that's dedicated to the study of the future. Well, he's wrong, isn't he? Universities might not have been doing that in the 1930s, but rulers and governments have always been interested in those who claim to be able to foresee what it was that was to come. Whether you go from the Sibyls of ancient Greece and the biblical prophets through John Dee and the other Hermetic philosophers, even to the strategic military planning and the wargaming that came to prominence in the early Cold War era, the modelling of environmental futures that produced World and World 3, and eventually the Club of Rome's limits to growth. All of these things have the same kind of aim, anticipation, but they all use very different methodologies, and they also have very different conceptions of chronology and time. They're doing the same thing, they're using the same language, but they mean fundamentally different things. And that's obviously, it's part of the trouble with the future. It keeps on changing, and part of that was one of the most interesting things about doing the Unsettling Scientific Studies project. in terms of, I'm not going to go into any detail about the historiography of time itself. I'm sure that there are many people in this room more qualified to comment on that than I am. You can have the notion of the wheel of time cycling through repeating ages, an arrow that moves from cause to effect, or even a Hoovian model that rejects cause and effect in favour of a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint that sees instead a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. But to me, what's most interesting here is the identification, and Barbara Adams has done some interesting work on this, the identification of different ways of seeing the future. And there's at least two, maybe three of these here, two of which are deeply rooted in past and present historiographical practice. So first you've got the kind of notion of the future as fixed and independent of human action, that is to say predestined, if you want to use that particular word, to be known only through divine revelation. You access the future because God speaks to you in some way, whether directly or by reading the information in some other fashion, whether it's gifted to particular individuals or whether it's hidden in biblical chronologies and accessible only through a process of prolonged and dedicated devotional calculation. Or secondly, you could see the future as the product of what one can rather portentously or even pretentiously call the unconscious laws of history. I'm obviously thinking of Comte and Marx, whether positivist or Marxist. The attempt to identify patterns in the past in order to be able to model likely future directions. And in both those cases, you see the future as largely unchangeable. All the efforts that you make to avoid your fate only actually move you closer to that which you are trying to avoid. The Servants of Samara is a classic example here. And it's also actually a theme that's picked up in many stories about the paradoxes of time travel, where it's the attempt to change the future that actually creates the present. Excellent examples here are Jodi Taylor's best-selling book series, and it is best-selling. These things, hotcakes, have got nothing in them. It's called The Chronicles of St. Mary's, and they deal with the investigation of historical events in contemporary time, i.e. time travel. They travel through time and actually watch the fall of Troy and all the rest of it. It's a very funny and it's a very dark series, although historiographically it's absolutely appalling. Not least because of the way in which it reifies capital H history as a thing that exists independently of human activity in past and present. History, in this very popular, almost hunter-gatherer mode, is the process of collecting lots of facts and putting them together in their correct order. And the assumption is that there is a correct order that you can put the facts into, and there's just that one correct order. It's not even that the path to the future is fated, but there's only one true way of understanding how we got to the present. The idea that historical facts might emerge out of a critical interrogation of a range of different sources and can be subject to a number of different interpretations is nowhere referenced in this particular account. In both cases, both the past and the future are fixed, and while not accessible to human control, not subject to human control, are accessible by human endeavour. But the third example looks rather different. The notion that emerges in the early 20th century that the future is actually something that you can model, that you can control, and that you can plan. An abstract but a quantifiable element in human life. You had to have considerable resources to attempt to control that future, but if you could claim to be able to manage the future, then you were also likely to gain access to considerable resources. If you choose the right circumstances, you could in fact make your own history. And a fascinating, although still obviously only partially told, example of this can be found in the efforts by various historians to investigate the attempts by the USA to predict the movements of the USSR in the immediate post-war period, in the very early Cold War period, from the assumption that the Soviets wouldn't go atomic until the late 1950s, from the impact that Sputnik then had. And there what you can see from the work of these scholars is the emergence of the Office of Strategic Services, the Joint Intelligence Committee, Combined Intelligence Committee, Central Intelligence, all kinds of a proliferation of different groups, all marked by inter-service and bureaucratic infighting over resources, present and future. This is why the future is important. It involves these controlled resources. And the use of fiction here, interestingly, in the explicit use of war games, was absolutely crucial. The speed of nuclear war meant that decisions would have to be made incredibly quickly. So gaming wasn't just a means of forecasting the future. It wasn't just a means of forecasting what was to come. It was a means of socialising participants in a particular series of responses, in a particular set of responses into what to expect in certain scenarios, how to anticipate and how to act in a critical and potentially combustible, as we saw in the number of near misses, combination. But at the heart of it all was the assumption that human agency was at the heart of it all. There was nothing necessarily inevitable about the human future. It was the product of human decision-making. Although the future here was still imagined as universal, which I guess is inevitable when you're talking about blowing up the world. You can't really get a local version of that. By the 60s, and this is the kind of thing that I'm charting out here, that notion of agency is again being constrained by the emergence of concerns about the environment, the development of new strategies, new methodologies. I keep coming back to how this is being done, what is being used, how are these ideas being operationalised, new strategies for modelling environmental rather than military or corporate futures. So the work of Donella and Dennis Meadows in producing the simulations that I mentioned earlier on, World and World 3, were important. They moved on from modelling the behaviour of discrete systems to using historical information in the context of key assumptions about accelerating industrialisation, population growth, malnutrition, resource depletion and environmental loss, bringing them together to try to model the entire world, to show that different patterns of behaviour would generate different futures. So humanity has choices, but since almost all of those choices end in disaster because of the limits to growth theory in and of itself, the fact that there was, as the Club of Rome had suggested, limits to growth. But this was a future that's being created by electrical engineers and management theorists, where the key factor that's at the heart of these modellings, the key factor that's driving them is energy flow. That's what they're talking about, whether you think of it as energy flow in terms of calories, in terms of money, in terms of minerals, that's what they're concerned with. But what happens when ecologists get involved with using history to predict global futures? So, in the early 21st century, Turchin had started building on the work of Jack Goldstone. In the 1990s, he tried to apply complexity science to human behaviour by trying to model de Tocqueville's arguments into a set of equations. And in particular, basically that while political instability might be based on economic inequality, at the heart of this was a cyclical phenomenon rather than class conflict. Turchin, who was originally a population ecologist, tried to relate political instability to population size and to economic output. And he used a range of different sources to do this, from the number of coin hoards that were found buried in people's gardens, to the size of houses, to Greenland ice cores, to skeletal abnormalities, using a range of different variables in an effort to try to identify both population size and levels of economic activity, and crucially levels of economic inequality going nearly back to the Neolithic. And to try and chart this against wars, rebellions, insurrections and so on. He identified two key things that that he considered to be important. The secular socio-demographic cycles, which lasted for a couple of 200 to 300 years, and basically waves of kind of social instability that rise on the back of population growth. So those are the big kind of waves that sort of run through history from his perspective. And then much shorter father-son cycles where basically the father experiences lots and lots of violence and everyone gets killed and there's war and everyone's dead and he's sickened by it, and the son is kind of turned off violence because of that. And then when his son is born, he doesn't have that experience, so he thinks, violence is cool, let's have more violence again. So, and he has that kind of that small scale ripple effect underneath these broader waves. Essentially, as I say, what he's doing is correlating political instability with political, economic and demographic variables on a global scale, which means that he has to try and figure out, obviously, different ways, but comparable ways of measuring each of these variables, because, as I say, he's taking us back to the Neolithic. This is a long period of time to start talking about patterns. Social structure, for example, he treats as the product of health and wealth inequality. But then, of course, you need to choose appropriate or approximate proxies for them. So you can map these proxies as they change over time. But the nature of that change may be qualitative or it may be quantitative. And if the change is qualitative, then obviously the question of whether or not you're measuring the same thing obviously arises and is not sufficiently dealt with. We'll come back to that. But at the heart of the project are these three themes. First, that the notion that you can and that it's useful to understand the past through this cyclical pattern. As I say, 2 to 3 centuries in which eventually labour supply outstrips demand, the living standards of the poorest fall, the elite becomes top-heavy with too many graduates, as we've previously noted, and that then leads to social collapse. So secondly, you've got the pattern, and secondly you've got the idea, the kind of conceptual assumption behind this, the idea that history, like other sciences, he references astronomy and evolutionary biology, we'll come back to that history can produce hypotheses that can be falsified, right? That can be tested against the data and can be proved to be found wanting. He says at one point, there are hundreds and hundreds of explanations for why the Roman Empire fell. This is ridiculous. We only need one. Well, maybe we kind of need lots of different explanations about why. Anyway, we'll come back to it. So the idea that you can test, that you can progress history by constructing hypotheses that can be then tested against these enormous data sets. And you can use that then further to develop you can use them to develop experiments with history. You can come up with experimental computer simulations where you've got digital agents who represent things like households, interacting according to predetermined rules like seasonal migration patterns or ethnic alliances or whatever. And third, a passionate commitment to the idea that the point of doing this is to do something about it. That you're not just charting it to say, right, we're all going to hell in 2020, have a nice ride, kids. You're doing it so that people have information that can potentially make a difference. You can identify strategies to mitigate the likelihood of instability, or to ameliorate revolution. You can cut down on the number of graduates, for one thing, for example. His initial call to arms in Nature in 2003 explicitly compares history with medicine and with ecology. Just as they are concerned with maintaining the health of the body, so too should history take care of society. The quote is, quote, "Our understanding of what makes society healthy is in the pre-scientific stage. This situation is as risible as if, in physics, philosophy theory and thermodynamics coexisted on equal terms," end quote. It was time, he said, quote, "for history to become an analytic and even a predictive science," end quote. But he basically says there's no point talking to historians about this because they're much too obsessed with splitting. What we want are some lumpers. We'll never get lumpers in history, so we'll let them deal with all the little details and we will create. We, as in the Cliodynamics, we will pursue the theory and experimental testing and we will progress things on. And what's intriguing is that we've been here before in the human sense. The idea that there are general laws of history which can be identified and shown to lead to particular outcomes, the notion of a fixed fate, combined with the notion that identifying the issue in enough detail will enable you to do something about the problem. It's a combination almost of kind of like comped with 1970s town planners, if I can put it like that. But we've been here before in the fictional sense as well. Because when I met Cliodynamics, the first thing I thought of was psychohistory. So, in 1941, early 1940s, Isaac Asimov, I found a picture of Isaac Asimov without the mutton chop whiskers. It was really hard, and I eventually found it on Wikipedia, which tells you that sometimes you should just use Wikipedia to save time. He was only around 20 years old, and he sold a story to John Campbell. That's him up there with a very fetching cigarette holder. He pitched an idea for a science fiction story to John Campbell. His story was set in the impossibly far future. As it opens, we're told that it's been 12,000 years since the Galactic Empire was founded, as distant from us as we are now from the dawn of agriculture. But it's only at this point, Asimov suggests, that science has become sufficiently advanced and the human population has become big enough to enable scientists to predict human behaviour, to predict the future, not the future of individuals. What's really interesting here is that Asimov, he's trained as a chemist, and he actually manages to write one of the few science fiction stories that actually turns on chemistry. There are very, very few SF stories that actually deal properly with chemistry. And his idea is that if you've got a sufficiently large statistical universe, or indeed in this case, a sufficiently large galactic empire of human beings, it becomes possible to predict their behaviour in the same way that the kinetic theory of gases enables you to predict the movement of molecules. As with Cliodynamics, once you've got a big enough data set, patterns will start to emerge which you can then use to see crises coming and again take action to stave them off. Harry Seldon, these are two pictures of Harry here. I think if anybody skilled in the reading of images would have lots of interesting things to say about the way in which the scientist, Seldon, is being portrayed both within the story and to the audiences. Harry Seldon, Asimov's psychohistorical protagonist, he couldn't prevent the fall of the Galactic Empire. But what he could do was to shorten the 30,000-year period of misery that was the Dark Ages that was supposed to follow that fall. He could shorten it if he could get a small group of scientists and engineers who could keep the flame of knowledge alight. Then he could shorten that period of the Dark Ages to 1,000 years. Now, he was encouraged to develop his psychohistorical account of the human future by John Campbell, who was generally keen on this kind of thing. But he was also being influenced, and this is interesting when you think about the later career of Asimov as well, he was also being interested by a group called the Futurians, under the leadership of Donald Wollheim. And what Wollheim and his ally, or his colleague John B. Mitchell, this perspective came to be known as Michaelism by Sam Moskowitz, who was a key early historian of science fiction. What they were arguing was for the utopian role of science fiction. And utopia is not quite the right word, but the idea that, as we've said there, that science fiction, writers and readers should be actively working for the realisation of the scientific world state as the only genuine justification for their activities and existence. So, as Asimov's creating the science of psychohistory, you've got this belief that science fiction should by nature stand for all forces working for a more unified world, a more utopian existence, the application of science to human happiness, and a saner outlook on life. There's a lot to be said, actually, looking at Asimov's work as a means of teaching utilitarianism. It's a fascinating thing to pursue. Now, we're going to return to the world state later with H.G. Wells. But the key point is to note that the role of science fiction, as far as Asimov and his contemporaries was concerned, was that it should be presenting humanity with better choices, with better options. It had a political dimension, an activist dimension. It wasn't just something for people to read in their bedrooms. It was something to be done, not just something to be consumed. Before we go completely mad on the idea that Asimov's the influence over the left-wing part of society was tremendous, we should also note that the appeal of the Foundation series was across the political spectrum. Newt Gingrich was, for example, fundamentally influenced, also he says, by the idea of psychohistory as a probabilistic and a testable means of forecasting the future of whole civilizations, and crucially, as a means of combining politics and technology in futurism. Apparently, even Elon Musk sent the Foundation novels to space in the Tesla Roadster, along with, what was the music? Was it, Is There Life on Mars? That was what was playing, wasn't it? But here's the thing about the Foundation novels. They're set in the unimaginably far future, but it's a future that explicitly recapitulates history. Not only is the narrative explicitly inspired by and based on Gibbon's decline and fall of the Roman Empire, even to the point where, if you look at the stylistic patterns that Asimov uses from time to time, you can see the influence of Gibbon there. But the situations and the backgrounds of the key characters are rehashings of history as we know it, or as we think we know it. As we think, as the kind of ideas and the kind of tropes that have wider public circulation. A small group of scholars keeping knowledge alive against the backgrounds of the invading barbarian hordes. Well, whether they're scientists or monk, check, we've got that. A group of merchant princes maintaining monopolies in the interests of keeping their balance sheets alive, check. A priestly cadre constraining the behaviour of a divinely chosen king. Guerrilla fighters in urban streets, armies retreating under scorched earth policies. A key part of the resonance and the relevance of Asimov's features was the fact it's already happened. We've seen it, we know it, it's familiar. It's not challenging because we know that these things have already occurred. And this is what ties together all of these predictive and anticipatory strategies. They are relying on the notion that the past is going to be a reliable guide, well, a reliable if not necessarily accurate guide to the future. You make predictions about what's to come because you know what people have done under similar circumstances in the past. But what if the past isn't any longer a guide, even if it could still be a warning? The assumptions behind the laws of history or psychohistory and the capacity for prediction or forecast has been that even as socio-economic or cultural context changes, human nature, quote unquote, will remain constant. But in the first instance, this human nature is all too often a white, male, professional, urban nature. It's one of the things that Charlotte and I talk about a lot in our book on Human. In the second, another key theme of the 20th and 21st centuries has been the point that the speed of socio-technological development is now such that the past is no longer a good guide to the present, much less the future, not least because of the way that socio-technical innovation is changing the way that some communities approach both the practice and the imagination of the biological and digital and moral understanding of humanity itself. Let's go back to Asimov for a moment. He's generally considered to be utterly useless a character. Right? He's great at puzzles, lovely puzzle stories, but he's absolutely pants when it comes to doing an emotion. He can do dialogue, but he can't do feeling. This is mostly right, and for the record, I don't consider that to be necessarily a bad thing. But he is good at a particular kind of character. The key figure in Foundation isn't Harry Seldon or Hobo Mallow or Selva Hardin or any of the others. The key figure is Trantor, the city the size of a planet that's at the heart of the galactic empire. And incidentally, the heroes of his other novels are also cities, and they're all basically different versions of New York, which is essentially Asimov's womb with a view. Trantor is a metal world. It's already in the process of rusting when Harry Seldon arrives at it. But it not only encapsulates and encloses humanity, it consists of a series of interlocking and interdependent socio-feral systems, or ferrosystems, where communities are being shaped by their dependence on that steel and by the capacity of that steel to create a bedrock for communal life. Can you tell I'm from Port Talbot, by the way? I get obsessed with steel from time to time. The capacity of that steel to create the bedrock for human life. And this is part of a much broader theme within science fiction, the mutually constitutive relationship between the concept of the city, the concept of civilization, and the concept of humanity itself. In much of science fiction, the destruction of a particular city, whether it's the slow disintegration of London in John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids, or even an individual iconic building, as in the 20-second countdown that obliterates the White House in Independence Day, and many other films. Other films are available on Independence Day to see the obliteration of the White House. It's emblematic of the destruction of civilization itself. With that shift in the physical landscape comes a fundamental alteration of the social contract. But at the same time, what it reflects is something that was always obvious, that cities are inherently unstable. They exist. They depend on the existence of a complex division of labour, both in terms of the labour that's performed within the city and in relation to the goods-in, waste-out balance on which the city permanently teeters. Any disruption of that, and the balance becomes fatally compromised. The city, as emblematic of humanity's greatest achievement, is also the embodiment of the Achilles heel, and that's just if you look at it on a day-to-day basis. If instead you consider the city in evolutionary time, if you can do that, then its threat is both more compelling and more insidious. As the argument goes, both in science fiction and in public debates of policy, cities, civilization, has detached influential segments of, or indeed humanity itself, from a connection with nature. As a result, humanity is degenerating. Men, always men, are no longer compelled to pit themselves against predators in order to provide food for their children. They can draw an allowance from the dole, or they can simply abandon their families, securing the knowledge that the state will provide. Without the need to struggle, how can a population be fit? And these themes of over-civilization and degeneration are key to Asimov's Foundation, and also to, obviously, the work of H.G. Wells, The Time Machine, The Sleeper, Wakes, and First Man in the Moon. I said I was from Port Talbot. The Elohim and the Morlocks living apparently simple lives, both on and underneath the surface of the planet, 800,000 years hence. It makes Asimov 12,000 years seem positively a blink in Clio's eyes. They're the results of that complex division of labour. The Eloi, descendants of the leisured classes, have degenerated intellectually because they haven't needed to work anymore. The Morlocks, while maintaining their intellect through their engagement with the technologies that still extant, have degenerated morally, dining off fine Eloi flesh. Both species are post-human. Well, they're no longer human. They come after humans. They must be post-human. And their post-humanity is what happens when humans come to exist in an urban, industrialised environment characterised by ongoing socio-technological innovation. Another version of this can be seen in Wells's vision of a lunar society. So in The First Men in the Moon, what we find out is that the Selenites have taken the division of labour and the organic analogy to extremes, creating specific types of workers to do particular jobs through a combination of breeding and selective, well, not foot binding, but body binding. Wells' protagonist, Cavor, is particularly sickened by the sight of an embryonic Selenite enclosed in a jar which only enables the child's hands to grow, the better to facilitate their manipulative prowess and also to avoid wasting calories on useless things like, for example, legs. You just need to sit there and twiddle things, so you don't need legs, do you? But as Wells wonders, perhaps training children, like bonsai trees, so that they grow ready-shaped for their job in the machine environment is better than leading them on into a false hope of freedom right up until the point where the knife of intercession comes down between them and their souls. And The Sleeper Wakes is even more interesting because, unlike the Selenites, the society that Wells portrays there is clearly what he sees as the first step towards the Eloi and the Morlocks. The protagonist, Graham, I put that picture up there because I love it, because basically the bit on the other side, this is them kind of floating off because Cavor has liberated them from the effects of gravity, and the line underneath it is, "We progress by leaps and bounds." I just think that was so sweet. Sorry, I had to explain this. It's not obvious in and of itself. So the protagonist, Graham, this is back to the Sleeper Wakes. He accidentally drugs himself into a protracted coma. He falls asleep for just over 200 years. He wakes in the 22nd century to discover that, thanks to compound interest, he now owns the world. So if you want to be rich, then put some money in the bank and go to sleep for a long period of time. Parliament, the monarchy, even national borders have been swept away by the plutocratic World Council, which acts in Graham's name, and the consequences for both the working and the leisured classes have been dire. The elite are now spoiled and lazy. There's no such thing as art, for example, anymore. The closest you get is hairdressing and tailoring of clothes, but even the clothes are increasingly extruded from machines rather than produced by humanity. The workers, who live most of their lives underground, gosh, how surprising, they wear different coloured clothes to identify their trades. They're employed on daily contracts. It's really hard not to use the word 0 hours there, but I was being good and not, judging the past by the standards of the present. They're employed on daily contracts, and they now speak a dialect that is so different that Graham can't understand them. Their speech is different. The family unit, motherhood, doesn't exist anymore, with children removed from their mothers at birth and cared for by robots, while the adults live and eat communally, if they can. If they can't find work, and they either starve or they have to enlist in the Labour Company, which is also owned by Graham, much to his horror, which is essentially a means of slowly enslaving the working population, since any child that's born to the company belongs to the company. And the Labour Company, that turns out, was originally the Salvation Army, which I'd forgotten just how much the Sally Army was hated by people at the turn of the century. I think of them as people just playing, music in the streets, but no, I always forget about that part of their history. But what's important is you can see the separation, whether it's the spatial, the linguistic, the biological separation of the workers from the rest of humanity. The workers are starting to look different. They're proto-Morlocks. Babble machines project endless propaganda, and even the church has become capitalist. So I love this particularly because, excuse me, it's something that gets picked up on very, very strongly by Robert Heinlein later on in his explorations of science fiction and religion. Salvation on the first floor and turn to the right. Put your money on your maker. The sharpest conversion in London. Expert operators. Look sleepy. What Christ would say to the sleeper. It's absolutely fantastic. And crucially, there are no more towns or villages in the world of the Sleeper Wakes. There's only the city and the country. And crucially, there are 5 cities. There are only 5 cities in Britain. There's London, there's Edinburgh, there's Manchester, there's Portsmouth, and intriguingly Shrewsbury. I have no idea. I mean, I went back and looked at it to try and figure out what did it... There we go. Who knows? They're domed. They're enclosed. The people are trapped in this alienated, uber-urban life. The city, or rather the capitalist city, creates this post-humanity. It's civilization, the heart of humanity's achievement. It's triumph over nature that's the cause of the ultimate degeneration and loss. And this is a theme in the work of many other writers, science fiction or otherwise, including John Wyndham. In his novels, it was always civilization that ultimately did humanity in, sometimes helped by alien invaders like the Xenobathites of the Kraken Wakes, but more usually, as his protagonists often ruefully acknowledge, that we, quote, brought this lot down on ourselves, end quote. The monstrous human-eating plants of the day of the Triffids, they aren't aliens. They're the products of human genetic innovation. Again, an increasingly industrial and urban world population desperate for oil breeds a plant that can produce very, very useful oil. It's just a shame that it's also carnivorous, armed, dangerous, and with a taste for human flesh. And it looks very much like a scrotum. I don't think that was possibly part of Wyndham's original conception. This is just the way the Daily Sketch took it. Wyndham, like Walheim and the other Futurians, saw an explicit role for science fiction in these emerging socio-technical imaginaries of the 20th century. And that role was to present their audiences with the fact that choices existed. Society and technology evolved and changed together, neither one wholly determining the shape of the other. And it was possible to make a choice, to decide on the kind of future, the kind of science, the kind of technology, the kind of people that you wanted doing these kind of things. In Alistair Reynolds' wonderful Revelation Space universe, it's set 6 million years in the future, and it rockets around a Milky Way that's dotted with human and post-human societies. And it's fascinating because it's essentially a series of experimental interventions into the different ways that humans live with, or the humans experience technology, the proper relationship between technoscience, ethics, and sometimes causality. How does that create you? How does that enable you to create different ways of being people, of being human? But I also think it's fair to say that fascinating though Reynolds' characters and settings are, they often still reflect the same kind of presumptions about human nature and what drives humanity that are apparent in more academic discussions of post-humanity, especially those that tend to come from the more, I don't want to be rude, philosophical, computational side of the spectrum. Discussions of whole brain uploads, for example, as in Robin Hanson's The Age of M, where again, all of these uploaded brains are very professional, very male, very white, although he does toy with including some child brains, which is... If I figured it out right, so he's included child brains because he says that humanity has always lived alongside children, well, yeah, and therefore something important about humanity would be lost if we didn't experience children. What? I might have missed something, but I don't think I have. But there is at least one extraordinary fictional exploration of not a post-human world, but a pre-human world, and one which I would recommend to anybody who is interested in considering how fiction, how speculative literature can help us conceive of ways of being human that aren't white, that aren't male, that aren't middle class, that aren't capitalist. And that book is Golding's The Inheritors, which investigates an encounter between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And of all the science fiction books I've ever read, that one does the best job of creating the sense of a non-human, even a non-cognitive intelligence, an awareness of the world, or an intelligence that's kinesthetic rather than computational, a world in which agency is expressly collective, collaborative, and indeed emergent rather than rational, individual, even dare I say neoliberal. It's a wholly original way of portraying being in the world. And that brings us back to Cliodynamics. I admit it's been a bit of a Cook's tour. Are we allowed to say Cook's tour anymore? Or is that gone by the... Anyway. The problem here isn't that the proponents of the perspective are using the past to predict the future in order to save society from disintegration. The problem isn't even entirely that they're adopting a profoundly positivist and Whiggish approach in so doing. The problem is that they're assuming that the future will, broadly speaking, look much like the past, and they're doing so without realising how profoundly impoverished their vision of that past actually is, when considered from the perspective of historians, much less from the perspective of writers whose job it is explicitly to consider how we can do humanity differently. I don't need to rehash this with you. I mean, words, ideas, concepts, they change meaning over time, which raises really key questions about the nature of the proxies that are being deployed to measure health and social inequality. Even where participants are actively trying to seek out data that they can define as these are the facts that speak for themselves, like the notion that an increase in the level of coin hoarding can be used as a proxy for increasing levels of anxiety about the future. Well, okay, so well, I'm sure we can explore the problems there. And let's not even go to whether death recorded actually means an executed human. The data sets that Cliodynamicists are using, they might be huge, but they represent only a very, very partial portrait of humanity's past. And even within that, of all the archives and the data that have survived, not all of it is going to be subject or susceptible to quantification. I'm not the first to point this out, and I'm not going to be the last. And it's a critique that the scholars of the human sciences have raised repeatedly against our colleagues in the natural sciences who've made similar past efforts at abstracting general laws of human nature. But things have changed since the sociobiology wars. They've even changed since the science wars, especially for history. Quantitative history, as historians understand it, in the form of economic or econ-social history, has become less popular than it was when I was an undergraduate, much less visible in terms of its public profile. At the same time, the digital humanities, which by their nature are much, much, much more susceptible to quantitative analysis, have rocketed up the intellectual agenda. I cannot remember the last time I wrote a grant proposal that didn't include the words digital humanities as a key deliverable. The way we do our jobs is changing radically. Nobody ever taught me about keyword searches or how keyword identification relates to the nature of conceptualization, both the conceptualizations of historians and the conceptualizations of the people that are building the digital sites that we're using to search. But this is fundamental now to how students and scholars navigate, or fail to navigate, remember all those recorded deaths, the digital archives and journal databases. We have to collaborate with software specialists, to work with GPS, to recognise, as Tim Hitchcock, one of the scholars responsible for the Old Bailey project, to recognise the challenges as well as the benefits that are brought by something that looks so simple, optical character recognition, and the assumptions that are encoded within that piece of in that concept. Can you really measure happiness over the course of centuries by textual linguistic searches? To reference another project that got a lot of publicity recently. History's cultural turn has in some ways taken us away from interrogating these bigger quantitative pictures, meaning that these large-scale efforts at global human histories are often being done by scholars who are not as historiographically aware as one might assume, which is why, of course, centres like gloknos are so important. But the digital humanities at the same time are changing the nature of the relationship between expert and layperson, between historians and the public, both in terms of the significance of public history as outreach and citizen history as knowledge creation, as in Sally Shuttleworth's fantastic project. At the same time as digital primary sources impact historical practice and the digital experience of the secondary and the tertiary literature change the way that we and our students navigate the scholarly landscape. I can't actually remember the last time I physically picked up a journal that I hadn't myself edited. And the only reason I was picking it up then was, oh, look, I did this, I'm so clever. I don't. You know, I search sites. And I use keywords to search sites. So everything that I would as a PhD student have encountered just because it's on the next page, I'm no longer seeing. And not everything is digitised. And not everyone, obviously, has regular access to the net. Asimov got round bias by arguing that his statistical universe, Galactic Empire, was sufficiently large to cancel it out. I'm not sure that this could apply to historical databases. But the increasingly digitalised landscape means that we desperately need more awareness of historicised quantitative approaches that take into account the fact that facts don't speak, they're spoken for, they're interpreted, the data is made meaningful by selection and by context. I want to end this talk by saying that for me, when I first met it, there were two things when I thought. First was, my God, this is psychohistory. And the second was, an ecologist has done this? That was what I found strangest, because much of my earlier career as a historian of science was spent talking to and working with field scientists, usually in behavioural biology, but with plenty of ecologists as well. And my experiences there were that whatever these people were, they were not positivists. That was the furthest thing from their minds. They were incredibly reflexive, constantly questioning how what they'd seen related to what they were actually writing down, how that might be affected by what was out of sight. You know, just because you can't see something because it's on the other side of the thicket or on the other side of the savannah doesn't mean that the baboons or the horse can't smell it, and doesn't mean that that thing that is over on the other side of the savannah is very, very socially present in the subsonic to the other elephants. They were tremendously aware of the gaps and the need, again, to be selective about what they observed and to put that explicitly in context so that later writers would be able to assess both what they saw and what they didn't see. My first book was on the way in which field scientists dealt with interpretive reflexivity in a context where variables were not under the control of scientists, and in a situation where data was inevitably and radically incomplete, in a place where Western scientists were operating on post-colonial territory, using field assistants and volunteers, citizen scientists, to gather data for later interpretation. I wasn't surprised then when I looked into Turchin's background more closely to discover that he was a theoretical ecologist. I'd very much like to know what a field ecologist or a behavioural biologist would make of the way in which he's operationalised population dynamics here. What can we conclude? I've tried to show you some ways in which non-historians make use of history to tell stories about the global future. And I do so in the awareness that as a historian of science, indeed as a sociologist of science, some historians, many historians, would not consider me to be a historian. In all of the cases I've touched on, the individuals involved were, and they are, seeking to make a difference. I don't think you can challenge anyone's motives here. To make a difference to the future, to make a better future, regardless of how impoverished by professional standards their understanding of that history might be. Fiction and quantification are the two methodologies at the heart of the two perspectives that I've spent most of my time discussing here. And these are not necessarily standard skills when it comes to historical training, but they're going to become, I think, an increasingly important part of the future historian in both senses as toolkits. Fiction and the emotional imagination, alongside a reflexive approach to quantification, I think will be key to helping the humanities navigate a digital, if not a post-human, age. I want to leave you with one thought. I'm not mad keen on making history scientific. I seriously doubt any historian of science is. But I'm equally averse to letting one particular perspective on how to do science having it all its own way when it comes to talking about a scientific approach to history. I would really love to see what could happen if we could get field scientists, especially behavioural biologists, those with experience, as I've said, of working with radically incomplete data sets and knowing that they need to be interpreted, not just translated, into a room with historians to talk about comparative methodologies when it comes to data or sources and the understanding of social behaviour and interaction. What could we learn about the history of, or the future of academia, if not humanity, from each other? And what would be added to it if we brought in science fiction writers to moderate the discussion? I'll end with my hero, Mr. Spock, using a symbol from his own heritage, a symbol from the thousands-year-old Jewish tradition, as a means of introducing peace to a wider galaxy. On that pretentious note, I'm going to shut up. Thank you very much for your attention. You've been incredibly quiet.